So we will now begin the second part of the session with a great contribution. We are really honored to have you here by Geoffrey West on life, growth, death, and sustainability from organisms to cities and society. Again, Geoffrey, I don't think I have to introduce to this community here. We are deeply honored that you are coming to speak to us. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really flattered and honored and look forward to other future conversations. And I really enjoyed the sessions today. They're quite complementary to the way I think about cities and the planet, and that's what I'm going to tell you about. You can see in the title, it's pretentious and grandiose. I can talk about almost anything, but what I am going to do is give you sort of the big picture, 100,000-foot level thinking about the planet and its potential future, and very much a systemic, integrated view, and sort of in the spirit, I realized, of what Bianca was saying, but quite different, actually, because I'm actually going to try to do science and show you some science and do it in this because I'm a physicist by training. I've spent my life doing fundamental physics, and I've worked a lot in biological problems, big questions of biology, and in more recent years, trying to develop something that's become known as the science of cities, trying to make it quantitative, predictive, analytic, and really try to understand some of the mechanisms that's led us to the kinds of questions that have been discussed here. But I'm going to begin with a remarkable quote from an amazing man, John von Neumann, one of the great scientists of the 20th century, great mathematical physicist, and I'll read it out, actually. The ever-accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race, beyond which human affairs as we know them not continue. And he said that nearly 70 years ago, and it's sort of amazing. And what is interesting about it is that von Neumann, everything he did, he mathematized. He put into mathematics, into models, and that's why we can use computers the way we use them today, and why we understand quantum mechanics the way we do, and so on and so forth. But he never did anything beyond making this statement, this sort of singular statement, and he left it floating. And so in some extraordinarily modest way, I'm actually going to try to put some flesh onto those words. And I'm going to do it by first showing you something that you're extremely familiar with. It's been mentioned, but no one has actually shown it. The population growth of the world in the last 12,000 years. And what you can see, beginning with the Industrial Revolution, when we discovered fossil fuels, we learned to exploit them. At the same time, we developed entrepreneurship and capitalism, free markets, which led us to this extraordinary world that we live in today, where the extraordinary beneficials, those of us in the developed world especially, benefited enormously from this. And what concomitantly, this singular behavior of the population rising almost vertically on this scale. Along with it is something, a graph you've already seen today that John showed of all the various metrics that you can measure, and that he showed a version of this, and you can't look at them all, but anything that you can sort of measure as a function of time, and they're all going, of course, similarly with population. They're all growing in this kind of hockey stick way, and he used the word exponential. It's actually faster than exponential. In fact, even though everybody knows we live in an exponentially expanding universe, most people don't realize we actually live in a faster than exponential socioeconomic universe, the world we actually live in today. And I can show you that because here's a picture that I have concocted of what I imagine a NASA satellite picture of the Earth at night would have looked like in the year I was born, which was 1940. And here it is today. And that is extraordinary. In that short period of time, well, short on the scale of what we're talking, I'm an old man now, but it's what has happened, of course, you can see, is the Earth is burnt up. It just keeps burning. What that represents is, you know what that is. The Earth is literally burning because all of that is night lights of cities, and almost all of that energy is driven by fossil fuels, and that simply means it's being burned. The planet is burning, and only an idiot would think that that does not affect the climate or warm the globe. Period. You don't have to be a scientist. You just have to see these pictures to know that. So, okay, now, what is that in numbers? Well, we've already seen some of these things. The average now to mid-century, we're urbanizing over 1 million people a week, maybe it's as much as 2 million. That's equivalent to adding a New York every few months, or a Rome, this big city, every few weeks. That's what we're doing now. And, so I concluded already when I started this work 15, 20 years ago, that the future of the planet, I don't care about climate change, inequality, all the things we talked about, fundamentally, it's all to do with cities. And that if we don't come to terms with cities, understanding cities, dealing with cities, we are, and I would use in a different audience, a word that is not allowed here or anywhere else actually, but that really describes it. And by the way, for those, since there's been a lot of talk about inequality, I'm going to stop here a moment. I come from a very, very poor working class family that grew up in what used to be called in London, they don't anymore, a slum. So I'm very conscious of some of the things that are being talked about today because I have actually personal experience, period. That's nothing to do with anything, but is to do with the way I express things sometimes. And one of the things that disappointed me for many years was that no one was paying any attention. Everybody would sort of pat me on the head and say, yes, yes, very good, move on. So I prefer the word Urbanocene, frankly, to Anthropocene, because it is cities, of course, cities are people, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, because I prefer that, I just want to throw that out, but that's what we think of when we use the word city, the infrastructure, the roads, the buildings, and all the electrical lines and everything else that goes on inside it. But that's not, of course, what a city is. This is what a city is. A city, that picture we saw and all those buildings are just a stage. They're just an infrastructure. They're just there as a backdrop, as a machine, the most amazing machine we've ever invented for facilitating social interaction. That's what cities are for. And that's why they're so attractive. They facilitate social interaction in order to increase innovation, to increase wealth production, in order to increase the standard and quality of life for all of the citizens. That's the sort of idea, if you like, that has emerged. So there's another picture and another picture. And you know what happens. Here we are here. A talks to B, B talks to C, C talks to D, and they talk back to each other. We build on each other. We create ideas continuously. Almost all those ideas are useless and pointless to anybody else. But what's amazing is what is going on in that picture and what is going on here is every once in a while, what is in the spirit of that dynamic produces theory of relativity or quantum mechanics or a Google or a General Motors or the Vatican. That's what produced it, that sort of dynamic. That underlying dynamic. And how does that all happen? It happens through networks. Networks dominate everything because cities, as you know, in terms of infrastructure, can be thought of as networks. The roads and electrical lines and so on, transport networks. They're supplied by energy networks. And there's the road networks of the United States, mainly highways. And it looks like loose spaghetti, but in fact it isn't, because if you choose one city, and you look at the traffic over a year coming out of it, going to everywhere in the United States, my God, it has a certain regularity to it. It has a certain pattern to it, a certain fractal-like self-similar behavior that looks like this, looks like a tree, looks like a forest, looks like you, inside you. And in fact, it's actually almost the same as what's going on inside you and keeping you alive, except you're three-dimensional and the city tends to be two-dimensional. And biology is replete with networks. And what is amazing about those networks, these kinds of networks, all of these networks implied here, is that the mathematics and physics of them lead to something extraordinary. Because you usually think, because of natural selection, all these organisms evolved with sort of arbitrarily and capriciously, with historical contingency. But if you look at something, the most fundamental quantity of your life, metabolic rate, how much food you need each day to stay alive, and you plot it versus size for a bunch of animals, this is what the theory predicts. It predicts that if you plot it logarithmically, going up by factors of 10, it should be a straight line. Completely antithetical to the idea that it's arbitrary and capricious, that the points lie sort of arbitrary over the graph. There are fundamental laws that constrain organisms and constrain every part of an organism. And the other thing about this is that the slope of that is predicted by the theory, by the mathematical theory, to be 3/4, the magic number of 3/4. And in fact, if you plot anything that you can measure about life anywhere, any part of life, from microscopic up to ecosystems, it looks like this, and the slope is a simple multiple of the number 1/4. The spiritual number of life is 4. You should know that. And the number 4 is the dimensionality of the world we live in, 3 + 1, your information. So there it is. And that's what it would be if it were linear, which is what you would naively might have expected. Double the size, double the number of cells, therefore double the amount of food you need. No, you are very economical. You, meaning a mammal, you double the size. Every time you double, you save 25%. So the bigger you are, the more efficient you are, and so on. And this has enormous implications across the entire biosphere around us. And I'm just going to show you one. I'm going to talk about growth because that's sort of fundamental to everything. How do you grow? You eat, you metabolize, you send metabolic energy through the network. It goes partially to maintain what's there, repairs damage to cells, and then it grows new ones. And you put that into mathematical form. And the thing that is fascinating about it is the income metabolic energy is sublinear. It's got this economy of scale. The less is needed per cell, but that's the supply, but the demand is increasing linearly, is increasing faster because you're adding cells at a linear rate. Therefore, eventually, you don't need genes or anything else. You stop growing. And that's why your growth curve looks like this. And you should have been worried your whole life. Why is it that you go on eating this huge amount of food each day? And guess what? You don't grow except a little bit this way. You don't grow ontogenetically. And it's because of this. Okay. So that's a hidden law of biology. I could show you 75. I would love to show you 75 of these all day because they're fascinating, they're beautiful, and they give you a spiritual understanding of life around you. But you can also ask the question, given all those laws, are there similar laws for things like cities or companies or universities? And I'm only going to talk about cities here. And the answer is yes. Here's one, a mundane one. This is the number of petrol stations versus size, plotted again logarithmically. And you see again a systematic behavior, and it's like biology. That dotted line is linear. There's an economy of scale. The bigger you are, the less gas stations you need per capita, and so on. And that's true. What is amazing about this is just 4 European cities. They all look the same. What is amazing is you look at cities across the globe, anywhere in Latin America, China, Japan, Australia. They all look exactly like this for gas stations, but guess what? It looks like that for all infrastructure. Buildings, roads, electrical lines, water lines, whatever. All infrastructure scales with this extraordinary, not 25% in biology, but 15%. The slope of that line is that those lines are about 0.85. And that means that things like the entropy produced, and it is disgraceful as a physicist, that the word entropy has not been used yet in this meeting because entropy, because that's what you're talking about when you're talking about dealing with these problems. You're dealing with the entropic forces that have occurred because of this dynamic. Here's one, the carbon emissions in cities. It scales sublinearly, which means the bigger the city, the less carbon produced per capita. Much greener to be in New York than to be in Santa Fe, where I live, or Chicago, smaller city. Bigger cities are greener in this sense, in this technical sense, than smaller cities, systematically. Okay, well, that's the uninteresting part of cities, in my opinion, the infrastructure, the physical. The interesting part is you and me, social networks, the interaction. There's a social network, symbolically. Those nodes are people and the lines that they're connecting them to their friends. But of course, what you realize is, and this is what you see if you look up papers on social networks, but it's very misleading because what you recognize is that each one of those people has to be in a place. They have to be somewhere, It doesn't matter how much you use the internet, you could be in your bathroom, you could be on a train. So not only do you have to be in a place, but you have to move from place to place. You have to go to the store, you have to take the kids to school, you have to go to the office, et cetera, et cetera. You have to hunt and gather, so to speak. And so you integrate, so the city is an extraordinary integration between the information exchange in social networks and the sort of biological part of it, which is its infrastructural network. And that's what that represented there. That picture in the middle that I showed earlier is exactly that. And the other point I want to make about that is that the infrastructure has a completely different time scale than the information system. That infrastructure could be there for 10, 20, or 1,000 or 2,000 years. But those people come and go. But the same dynamic continuous. People just get replaced, thank goodness. And the system evolves and innovates. Okay, so there it is. So here's this positive feedback in these social networks. That leads to a scaling. It's a similar network kind of thing as it was in biology, except it's information that's being exchanged. And instead of sublinear scaling, economy of scale, the bigger you are, the less per capita, which is what biology does, and which leads, by the way, to that, as I showed, that stopping of growth, that growth stops, which leads to, by the way, the stability of the system and why biology has been around for several billion years. Here, instead of the bigger you are, the less per capita, the bigger you are in social networks, the more per capita. And instead of the pace of life slowing down, as you increase in size, the pace of life increases. So that all comes out of the mathematics of these social networks. And of course, that's what we see. And here are just a panel of half a dozen. You can't really see them on this level, but there's half a dozen metrics. There's a GDP, there's crime, there's, I don't know, I can't even read them myself. I have them on here, but you can see them. But the point is they're very different in very different countries, and they all look the same. So it tells you something, first of all, that we have an understanding where they come from. They all come, why are they all the same? Because they all come from social interactions. Secondly, it also shows you that they're all interconnected. And if you, I'm use a bad word, if you mess around with one system, if you try to mitigate a problem here without thinking of it systemically, you're going to project unintended consequences over here. And the pandemic, which we're still going through, is a marvelous case of that. Who would think that an arbitrary mutation of a virus in Wuhan, China, would produce no flour in the United States, or Hertz would go bankrupt, or that there'd be no football in Spain, all within 2 months? Who would have ever thought they were connected? But you know something? They are connected. They're connected now, they were connected before, and they're going to be connected in the future. And if you only focus on one problem in one place, you are not going to solve the big problem. That's my message, basically. You do need to act on all those problems. But at some level, we've got to have a big picture. I'll be as quick as I can. So just this is it in English, the good, bad, and the ugly. On average, if you double the size of a city, you systematically save 15% on all infrastructure, and therefore on some of the bad things that happen from it. And at the same time, you increase all the good things like income, wealth, ideas, patents, college education, but also the bad things, crime, social and AIDS, flu, and COVID, and so on. I'll miss this out. I'm going to go quick. Okay, I'm going to finish up very quickly the kind of thing that Bjorka was saying. Can I get an equation for the entire planet? Let's consider the planet as a whole. And I call it, immodestly, a master Anthropocene equation, and develop what I consider a systemic theory of sustainability. So here's this picture again that John showed earlier. And there they are, all those hockey sticks. Well, I'm going to translate that into something that you can translate that into these scaling relationships. And you can I just take three of the obvious ones, energy, GDP, and water, and plotted them versus population size. And there they all scale, and they all scale superlinearly, as they do for individual cities. but they scale superlinearly. And just a side comment, you notice they have a little crick in them, and that crick is actually very significant, and I fortunately won't have time to talk about it. I'll mention it briefly again, but here's I'm going to finish up very quickly with this. Here's the equation, basically, and I'm obviously not going to do the mathematics. I'm going to tell you it in English. It's just like the way you grew. You have a metabolic rate. John has been referring to a social metabolic rate. That's the metabolic rate of the whole planet. That gets a portion between maintenance. You maintain the entire system as it is, every person, every piece of infrastructure, everything, and then you add new stuff, including people and therefore ideas and institutions and so on. Well, you have to put that into mathematics. It seems daunting and awesome, but you can do it. And you can solve the equations amazingly. Oops. Oh, I just want to say one thing, because you did mention metabolic rate. I don't know if you know this. Your metabolic rate sitting here, waiting for me to finish this interminably long talk, is about 100 watts. Your light bulb, that's all you do. 2,000 food calories a day. You are incredibly efficient. Your social metabolic rate, that is all the energy you need to be sitting here with the lights on in the building and get in a car and get on a plane and go somewhere. You add all that up per individual, is 100 times bigger. We are so profligate and so inefficient. It's I was going to say sinful, I was saying in the Vatican, but okay. So here's the metabolic rate graph. That's how we evolved. I could show you 50 of these with human beings on it. We fit exactly where we are. We have the right metabolic rate for our size. We have the right length of our aorta. We have the right, the right diffusion of oxygen through our lungs and so on, all 50 of these. This is where we are now. We've gone way up, and you can ask, how big an animal are we? You are roughly, each one of us in this room weighs about 30,000 kilograms in terms of what we are doing on this planet, or about a dozen elephants, Asian or Asiatic, I don't care. And I want to finish up with this. The growth curve for sublinear scaling was this. That led to stability and sustainability. Superlinear scaling leads to open-ended growth. And so this is wonderful. This is great, actually, because you say, look, I have positive feedback in social networks. That leads to superlinear scaling. And superlinear scaling, wow, it leads to open-ended growth. That's what we have. So there's a complete theory. It agrees with all the data. Wonderful. But it also has built into it something called a finite time singularity, which is that dot there, which says that in some finite time in the future, could be next year, could be 5 years, could be 10 years or 50 years, the socioeconomic metric will become infinite, which is completely nuts. And the theory tells you what happens. It says the system collapses. So how do you avoid that? You avoid it by innovating. What you realize is you've grown, assuming that you've invented bronze, or you've discovered coal, or you've invented a computer, or you've invented IT. That's a whole new paradigm. And so if you continue with that, you would collapse. So you have to reinvent yourself. You have to make a paradigm shift. You have to make a major innovation. You have to reset the condition, just as you might be for an individual. And you start over again. You hit a singularity, you collapse, and so on. So there's a theorem. If you want unbounded growth, you have to have continuous cycles of innovation, but they have to come faster and faster. And there's the data that supports it. I'm late, so I'm not going to tell you, but all the data supports the theory. The theory predicts almost exactly what it is. And you cannot do this stuff without mathematics, and it would be a sin for me as a mathematical physicist not to write one equation, damn it. So there it is, because the theory predicts what's going to happen, where that singularity is, and it tells you the form of the equation as you approach that singularity. And if you plot what it says, if you plot the metric, whatever it is, versus that difference, the time of approach to singularity, and this is the data. And there they are straight, they should be straight lines, it's predicted. Not only is it predicted that it's a straight line, but the numbers are predicted by the theory. And so we're headed for a singularity, whether you like it or not. That's the data is telling you that. So we better do something about it. And it's all to do with, ultimately, social interactions and cities. So that's what I've said here, and I finish. that's who we are. We're Sisyphus pushing this bloody thing up the wall, up the hill, and it rolls down again. We have to push it up faster and faster. And the question is, how sustainable is that? And how do we intervene not to do it? And that's what von Neumann was warning us about. And these are the wonderful people that I work with. And it's quite diverse in everything from anthropologists to economists to geographers to, I don't know, whatever, and all kinds of races and creeds and sexes and genders and I don't know what. But it's wonderful. And I'm not going to advertise my book, but you can read all about it. But the other parts I'm not going to talk about, I know you're going to kill me. Inequality, you can do inequality, which I realized was other people can talk. Diversity and the laws that govern diversity, the laws that govern inequality, the laws that govern movement in cities, and finally, fecundity. The fact that in developed countries, doesn't that surprise you that I only have 2 children and people living in poverty have 10 children, or that my great-grandparents had 10 or 12 children? Why is that? Why? I should be able to I'm much richer than my great-grandparents. I should afford to have 20 children, actually. But I don't. Why? And that's all here. Okay, I finished there, and I apologize for going on too long.
Well, that's the amazing thing, to have a mathematical physicist and an architect and anthropologist and policy specialist in the same room. So we really appreciate these different inputs and somehow need to connect these dots, what these different disciplinary angles tell us. So I'm calling quick comments. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time. Mark.
Since you didn't show the book, Professor West, just to show you here the fantastic book, I recommend all of you to read it. It was really inspiring. I have a question, though, because exactly, I am the representative. So I had a question, Professor West, because it made me think a lot during this year since I read the book, and then, as you know, I am even developing a specific program here in Rome called BioCities that is very much inspired by your work. But and by the way, a comment before the question, to draw a parallelism between forest and cities, because you mentioned that cities emerge because they are the most efficient system that we have built to optimize social interactions. I think forests are the cities of nature, and they are the system that also optimizes ecological interactions. It's where you host most of the biodiversity. But my question is, cities minimize the transactional cost, the infrastructural cost per capita. But at the same time, you say that they increase the pace of life. You mentioned in your book that the bigger the city, the faster the person walks, and then the person more consumes, the GDP increases. So are we not trapped into a vicious circle that the bigger the city, the more innovative we find solutions, that we create even more problems more faster? And then we are trapped in a vicious circle. So what could be the solution? Do we need smaller cities? Do we need to stop this growth in a way?
Saying at the end, that singularity in a way is a manifestation of this. You're continually building up on, which is great. I mean, it's what we do. It's what we're doing here. And it's an essential part of human interaction. But it has this extraordinary downside. I mean, it's hugely threatening. In fact, it may threaten the planet. Exactly that. And so the question is, how do you stop that? And the only way, I've had several thoughts on that. One is, first of all, to recognize that what I didn't show you, I intimated, the role of innovation plays a crucial role in this, the regenerating and so on. Is to recognize that what has happened in the last, especially 20 to 30 years, is the word innovation has become, at least among many people, synonymous with technology. That when you say, there's a new innovation, you immediately think of, well, this is an old one, but you think of a new iPhone or some new gadget and so on, or an electric car and so forth. And I think what we have to recognize is that that innovation has, of course, a much broader meaning. And what we should think of as a major innovation is a social or cultural innovation. And so that's one possibility, is that there's a cultural innovation, that is the way we interact has to change. Now that may be impossible. I know it may be, this is built into our DNA, I don't know. But the other thing, the other part of it is that that plays a crucial role in social innovation and cultural change is leadership. You know, even though it may come from sort of bottom up, in the end, major changes are often embodied in a person. Everything from, you know, Buddha or Jesus or Mahatma Gandhi or whatever that sort of somehow coalesces. And I would say, I know this is a provocative thing to say. And in the United States, in recent years, it was embodied in Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump did something that most of us thought was impossible. That was, in 1 year, effectively, he suddenly, you know, the common way of thinking was that instead of we believe in science and truth and data and you know, facts, well, they don't matter anymore. Suddenly, you know, fine, you know, that's not relevant anymore. And in 1 year, half of the population changed. And that seems to be something that has crept across the globe. And so I take that, actually, believe it or not, as a optimistic possibility, because what we need is an anti-Trump. Someone that, who was it did this? Was it you? Yes. I thought it was wonderful. Yeah, you weren't listening, I know, but listen, that wonderful slide you had near the beginning of your talk about love. That's what we, so if you had someone that did what you proposed, that somehow love was the thing, not individuality, but collective behavior, commonality, that we all subscribe to sort of neighborliness and to helping one another, independent of religion and ethnicity and so on. If we somehow had someone that could engender that in people, that would be a paradigm shift of one of those things. And that would be another way. That would change things entirely. So, but there's other things, and that's the kinds of things that have been talked about here. And but I do want, I would say that the lesson I got from this is that we need all of the things that are being people have talked about here that are done at a local or regional level, or in a short space of time, a long space of time. But overall, we need to think both two things: long term, and we need to think systemically, and we need to have an integrated big picture of what the hell we're doing. What is it that we're trying to do here, and how do all these things interface with one another? And I think that's the message I got from that's what the science is saying.